Hello and very warm welcome to this webinar. My name is Minbaeva and I'm professor at HRM, in HRM at King's College London, and I'll be your host today. This webinar is organized in order to feature latest research from the Academy's two journals, Journal of International Business Studies and Journal of Business Policy, Journal of International Business Policy. Our webinars aim at providing a forum for sharing most interesting and most recent research published or forthcoming in these two journals, and most importantly, discussing its implications. I'd like to thank the co-organizer for this series of webinars, Klaus Meyer from the IESE Business School, as well as AIB Secretariat for the logistics support and the Digital Motion for the technical support. You can actively participate in the discussion by posting your questions through the Q&A function in Zoom. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a button that says Q&A. So you can write your questions there. You would also be able to like the questions, which will make them move up in the queue. Then our moderator will pick up questions from the Q&A and direct them to the panelists. Please use this opportunity to engage, and we look forward to hearing from you. Though there is also a chat function, and I can see that we already been actively using that. That's great, and I hope we could continue using chat for the exchange of references or short comments, a little bit of a side discussion. However, if you would like to pose a question, so once again, please do that in the chat function. So I would like to introduce my co-pilot today, Professor Mila Lazarova from the South Fraser University, who would actually introduce our participants. So Mila, over to you.
Thank you, Dana, and good morning. It is morning where I am, but welcome to everyone from wherever you may be joining us. It is my absolute pleasure to be moderating the webinar today. That's a topic dear to my heart. These are some wonderful papers, and we're glad to have you with us. As you know, undoubtedly, given that you've registered for this, the topic of the day is the role of global mobility and knowledge transfer. So we've known that knowledge is the key source for competitive advantage, and knowledge transfer will always be critical for multinational organizations. And today we discuss three recent JIBS publications that cast light on how it travels from one unit of the MNC to the other, maybe back and forth. Recognizing that knowledge is embedded in individuals, the papers focus on the role of global mobility and seek to answer how individuals contribute to organizational success via intra-MNC knowledge transfer. We'll talk about expatriates, we'll talk about repatriates, we'll talk about repatriates, and knowledge flowing back and forth. Some questions we'll answer today are whether cultural intelligence matter for knowledge transfer, does it matter equally across contexts, what's the role of embeddedness in one's host unit, and embeddedness in headquarters, how are subsidiary growth and performance impacted by mobility-related knowledge transfer, and a lot more. And if you're a numbers person and you need some numbers, I'll give you some numbers about our webinar. We have a total of 7 authors that wrote these papers, and 4 of us are with us today. 3 of the 7 are called Sebastian, but only 1 of them is with us today. 3 of the authors are on more than 1 paper, but not the same one. And 1 of them is the Sebastian that's with us today. In terms of gender balance, 28.57% of the authors and 100% of the moderators are women. And you will hear from all of us today. So it's going to be a lot of fun. All the papers are knowledge transfer, and 100% of them are excellent. So Let me very briefly introduce the presenters. The way we're going to run this, we're going to hear all the papers. So if you have any questions about a paper that's just a clarifying thing, how do you measure this, or can you repeat your sample size? I'm happy to answer them between the papers, but let's save the juicy discussion for after the papers because they're actually quite related. They speak to the same themes. So the presenters that are with us today, Fabian, Froese, and I do apologize for butchering your name. I am trying here, who is a chair professor of human resource management and Asian business at the University of Goettingen in Germany and an editor-in-chief of Asian business and management. Previously, he was a professor of international business at Korea University. His research interests are within international HRM and cross-cultural management. Our next presenter will be Sebastian Reiche, who's a professor of people management at IESE, a business school in Barcelona, Spain. His research focuses on the forms, prerequisites, and consequences of global work, international HRM, global leadership and knowledge transfer. He's an associate editor of HRMJ, co-editor of Advances in Global Leadership, and also blogs on expatriation and global work issues. Heejin Kim is our third presenter. She's an associate professor of international business at Tohoku University in Japan. Her research interests are also within the area of international HRM, knowledge transfer, mobility, global R&D, and language management within Asian MNCs. She's also keen on qualitative methods, hoping to bridge Japanese-style fieldwork to international academia. Also joining us today as a panelist is Anne-Wil, who's a professor of international management at Middlesex University in London and a visiting professor at Tilburg, who's a co-author on one of the manuscripts. And with that out of the way, I am very pleased to hand it over to Fabian, who will present our first paper. Fabian?
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Mila, for organizing this wonderful webinar. And thank you all of you for joining us. I looked through the list. There are many familiar names. Good to see you. Actually, I can't see you, but hope to exchange some ideas with you. My paper that I would like to present to you is about cultural intelligence, knowledge sharing, embeddedness, and looking at different countries. And I think I don't need to introduce so much about why this is important, because I think most of us, they know global mobility, knowledge exchange is extremely important. So let me now start with presenting my paper. The paper is co-authored with two of my former doctoral students, Sebastian and Sam Davis, who are now faculty themselves in Dresden and in Bristol. And I think we had three major questions. The first question is about cultural intelligence. Does it help expatriates to have more cultural intelligence, to share more knowledge when being abroad? And the second question, the third one, are typical, I would say, academic research questions. It's about what are the underlying mechanisms or the mediation effects. And then I think the third question, so what we considered back then, that was really the novel aspect, what we haven't seen much, is looking at the role of the host country context. How does it differ across countries? And particularly conceptualize then the country context as a moderating effect in our relationship. Okay, so that's how our model looks. It's based on embeddedness perspective, trait activation theory, and institutional theory. So the main question is about cultural intelligence. Are people or certain people, they know how to behave in a cross-cultural context. Yeah, and we know from all kinds of research, it helps to sell products, to sell real estate, for marketing, and so forth. It helps for adjustment. The question is here, does cultural intelligence also help improve knowledge sharing among expatriates when living and working abroad? So probably you might think, yeah, it probably does. But what we want to know a little more about that. Why does it so? Why do expatriates with more cultural knowledge, cultural intelligence, can better share knowledge and exchange knowledge in foreign countries or locals? And the idea was here looking at embeddedness, because you possess more cultural intelligence, you're more familiar with different cultures, the people from different cultures, and then you can get more embedded into certain foreign societies. And then in turn, because you're better embedded, you're better exchanged, better connected, better fit, better linked to locals, then eventually you can also absorb more knowledge and then also transfer more knowledge from the expat, from the headquarters, maybe to the foreign country or to your foreign subsidiary. And knowledge sharing, we look into both sides. sending, sharing, transferring knowledge, and also receiving knowledge. And so that is all at the individual. An expatriate, maybe you or I, live in a foreign country, we get more embedded and then can share more knowledge. And I think what is really what we found, let's hear whether you agree or to what extent your reactions, that the really novel part is the upper part of our model. So to what extent does the country context, the host country context, influence these relationships? And there we looked into culture, and then also into regulation environment. So the original idea was looking at culture, that was our starting point, but then we wanted to conceptualize it. And in the international business context, many of you probably are familiar with institutional theory. Institutional theory can distinguish a country context into a formal environment, which is laws, regulations, and so forth, and an informal environment, which we would consider could be one component, could be culture or cultural values. Yeah, I'm very much interested in cross-cultural management. So culture is very important, yeah, but also regulations we would imagine would be important. Also what we know from institutional theory. In the context of expatriates, we wanted to think about particular aspects of the formal and informal environment that is particularly conducive or serve as a barrier for expatriates with cultural intelligence to get better embedded or less. So the idea was here to focus on cultural values, one cultural value in particular, which would be in-group collectivism, meaning people are very sticky, in particular also for locals, they try to stick to themselves, they're not as open towards out-group members or foreigners. And in those situations, countries are very in-group oriented, they're not very much welcoming to foreigners. It would be particularly helpful if an expatriate possesses this cultural intelligence and then can overcome this challenge and then would get more embedded and also be able to share more knowledge with host country nationals. And the other indicator we looked at was in terms of formal environment, and if you think of expatriates and the regulatory environment, and to what extent is foreigner friendly. And here we look at foreigner-friendly immigration policies, and then to what extent that also constrain or enable those expatriates with cultural intelligence to utilize their intelligence to get better embedded, and then eventually better able to share knowledge. So in this paper, I think, as you can see in my previous slide, we distinguish at the individual level and the country level. So we have a multi-level model. To what extent the country, the host country context at the country level may exert a cross-level interaction effect on individual relationships. And to do so, I think research design was very crucial. We spent probably several months, up to 6 months, preparing our research design, and then also collecting data at multiple stages, pilot studies, and so forth. And then, because we were interested in culture, we looked into globe, because whenever we do international business research, the limiting factor is very often cultural values. If we would like to use existing databases, there's limited choice. Some use Hofstede, Schwartz, we use Globe, or World Value Survey, but they do not cover so many countries. So that's where we started. So we looked into what countries are covered in Globe, and then very carefully selected countries that have global value scores. And then we did not look into all, but we carefully selected 30 countries, because for multi-level analysis, there's very often a rule of thumb. You need at least 30 level 2 units to analyze. And that's also what we did. And now I see also Mila just mentioned, now Globe has 140 countries, so it's much less of a limitation, but back then it used to be. Yeah, and that's how we started, and then collected data together with 20 research assistants from 13,000 people, and send out multiple time waves to generate sufficient data to analyze our multi-level model. And then the results are as follows. Most of our hypotheses are confirmed. Yeah, we're very pleased about that. Yeah, indeed, cultural intelligence helps to increase organizational embeddedness and ultimately also results in higher knowledge sharing. Then our cross-country level effects, cultural values were significant, and immigration policies on the formal environment did not have such a strong influence on these relationships. Probably many of you are familiar with these interaction plots. I don't want to go so much into detail here, but it just illustrates the significant effect, cross-level interaction effect of cultural values. And here we can see the black and dotted line shows then the country which is characterized by high in-group collectivism, such as Japan, Korea, some South American countries. And in those countries, it is particularly helpful if you possess cultural intelligence, and then you can take advantage of that and more easily integrate and get embedded into a foreign host country environment. Whereas in low in-group, very open societies, let's take the example of the US or Scandinavia, it's not so important. It's easier for any kind of expatriate to get embedded compared to those high in-group cultures. I think what we wanted to emphasize here in this webinar and also use as a starting point for our discussion is to look into implications. So some implication based on our study is, I think, as I tried to highlight, one of our novel and unique features of our study is that we really scrutinize the effect of host country effects. And we did find a significant cross-level effect of the cultural environment. And then the second point, cultural intelligence is really a hot topic, and many IB scholars, IB scholars, they're interested in cultural intelligence and how beneficial it is for various aspects. In our case, also for embeddedness and expatriate knowledge sharing. In terms of practical implications, I think these are fairly straightforward because cultural intelligence is important. So it would be important to select and train expatriates for cultural intelligence. Maybe also consider the cross-country, the environment where expatriates are being sent to. So meaning if you send expats to high in-group cultures, then it would be particularly good to send those expatriates who possess cultural intelligence. And then also embeddedness is important. So I would imagine for me, for many of us who do research, we always think about our next study. So what we want to study. These are some of the ideas that came up while doing our research and then also based on our findings. Yeah, role of host country is important. We only looked at one cultural value. We only looked at immigration policies. There's so many more factors, host country characteristics that are potentially important, and they could be studied as direct effect or maybe also as moderating effects and so forth. Then also what would be interesting to look into multiple stakeholders. We did a rather not simple, but we conducted a survey and we only surveyed expats. Knowledge sharing is not individual, it's an exchange process. Multiple parties are involved. There are a couple of people who look at host country nationals. And that could be colleagues, supervisors, subordinates. What about the headquarter connection? What about suppliers, consumers, and so forth? And all the interactions between these different stakeholders, and to what extent where does more or less knowledge takes place. We conducted a multi-level analysis. We encourage more. Yeah, what we did not do was looking at the organizational level. Ideally, we would have a 3-level or 4-level, individuals nested in teams or with supervisors in certain organizations and in different countries, maybe not all at once, but looking at different aspects of it. We looked at knowledge sharing, which is a process, give and take. Yeah, and there's a lot of research on knowledge transfer from headquarters to subsidiaries, but there's much less on learning or knowledge acquisition, and we would like to see more on that. And we tried already to look here to have a very well-planned and well-crafted research designs, and I think that would be also appreciated in future research, or maybe also completely different research methods than ours. Okay, I think that's from my side. I would like to say thank you, and that's it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fabian, for that presentation. Moving on to our next paper that will be presented by Sebastian Reiche. Sebastian?
Yes, hello. Thank you, Mila, for the introduction. Thanks very much, Dana, for hosting, coordinating this, and also from my side. Well, it's great to see so many of you connected from all across the globe, at least seeing familiar names rather than your faces. So let me share my screen as well. Okay. So here we go. And thanks very much, Fabian, for kicking us off. And so it's my pleasure to be presenting the second paper on behalf of Fabian, obviously, and well, the other Sebastians, right? So because this was how informally our paper was called, the three Sebastians paper. I think this was a first in our career, Fabian. Let's see whether there'll be more papers. But Sebastian Klar is out of academia, so he finished his PhD. So I'm not sure we can repeat this. But in this paper, what we really were interested in is to understand why, how, and when repatriates engage in knowledge transfer. And if you kind of think about the IEB literature, then of course it's common to conceive multinationals as networked organizations, which means that different units are dispersed across the globe. We know all this, but that means obviously that resources have to flow between these different units. And yet, what a lot of the literature has done so far is really focus more on flows from headquarters to subsidiaries. It's been changing more recently, but still there is a bit of a bias in terms of the direction of flows. And if you look at the terminology, such forward flows, that kind of is telling, and it tells us a bit about that bias. Of course, these flows, knowledge is one of those resources, can flow in different directions. While you can think of reverse flows from subsidiaries to headquarters, or lateral flows between subsidiaries. And in our paper, we're particularly interested in those reverse flows from knowledge from subsidiaries to headquarters. And so there's a great deal of knowledge that might be relevant for headquarters, right? So, for example, if multinational headquarters know about selling host country customs, that might help you to understand how to adapt work practices to the subsidiaries. If you understand the local market, how the local market operates, you can serve better customer needs. Understanding people's working styles in the host country context will help you to collaborate better. And it's very useful telling to understand how subsidiary employees, for example, understand the relationship with headquarters. So there's a great deal of knowledge that's relevant for headquarters. Now, repatriates, who are international signees, again, most of the audience is steeped in global mobility, so we're familiar with repatriates. Repatriates are assumingly well placed to act as such agents of reverse knowledge transfer because they've spent significant time in the host unit at the subsidiary level and then return home. I should say that obviously repatriation may include return from an international assignment to a different position. It may not necessarily be a return to the home unit. In our paper, we're particularly interested in return to the home unit. And in fact, we're focusing on assignees that are sent from headquarters to subsidiaries and then return to the headquarters. So it's a particular subset of repatriates, if you will. Now, repatriates are well placed to transfer knowledge. However, they often lack the organization mandate. We know from research, for example, that the mandate to transfer knowledge from headquarters to subsidiaries is much more formalized. And repatriates also tend to lack organizational support to do this. So we actually know fairly little about the mechanics of how really repatriate knowledge transfer functions, how it works. In fact, a recent review kind of looked at repatriate knowledge transfer and called this to be still in its infancy. So our aim really of the study was to understand why, how, and when do repatriates engage in this knowledge transfer. And so we built an organizational embeddedness perspective. Fabian introduced this already. I won't go into too much detail. It's steeped in the turnover literature. We applied this to the knowledge transfer literature. And in a nutshell, individuals can be embedded or stuck in the organizations because they perceive compatibility between their own knowledge, skills, values, abilities, and the job in the organization. They have social ties with others, and they may also perceive sacrifices if they were to leave the organization. Now, in the international assignment context, there's been actually a lot of focus on the fit dimension particularly, and that's particularly relevant for our context because perceiving compatibility between my own knowledge, skills, and the job and the organization unit that I'm in would have a lasting impact when we think about knowledge transfer that occurs after I'm leaving the host unit and come back to headquarters. So we're particularly focusing on the fit dimension. And of course, in the international assignment as well, individuals serve and are embedded in different organization units, so they serve two different masters, right? So you can be embedded in your home unit before you leave, you can be embedded in the host unit while you're on an assignment, and you will have to reestablish embeddedness fit with the headquarters when you return. And so our argument is similar to what Fabian introduced in the first paper, that if you're embedded in the organization, you can understand better where there might be knowledge needs. If you're embedded in another organization unit, you might also be better able to locate and access knowledge. So that should be should enable you to transfer knowledge. And so this is the embeddedness mechanism that we're looking at. And we're proposing two different pathways to repatriate knowledge transfer. And our starting point is perceived organization support, for the very reason is that we know that assignees receive support from organizations before, during, and after an assignment. That support helps them to settle into the assignment. It helps them to reintegrate after an assignment has ended. And so this should be a resource. In fact, it should provide both tangible resource in terms of training, support, mentoring, but also psychological resource in terms of stress management, feeling of confidence to get the job done, to become embedded. And so these two pathways to repatriate knowledge transfer then occur via two different types of embeddedness fit. The first, indirect pathway, indirect here because embeddedness leads to repatriate, proposed to lead to repatriate knowledge transfer via communication frequency. Here, the idea is that if the assignee is embedded in the host unit during the assignment, and this embeddedness essentially translates into continued contact with that host unit once the assignee returns to headquarters and has continued access to this host unit, then you'd be more likely to engage in a repatriate knowledge transfer. So all these relationships are positive, just to clarify. The direct pathway occurs again through embeddedness, but this time embeddedness in the headquarters. So once you're returning to headquarters, you're establishing your embeddedness because you're perceiving support from the organization. And because you're embedded in headquarters, you should be better able to see where their knowledge needs at headquarters. So you should be better able to transfer knowledge accordingly and in a more targeted way help solve work-related tasks. And then we bring these two pathways together. We're also predicting that you really need both aspects. You need to understand where their knowledge needs at headquarters to be able to transfer knowledge, but you should also be able to access and locate that knowledge that you've gained while you were abroad and have continued access to that knowledge once you've returned. Now, we've measured this in our study in a carefully designed multi-method time-lagged study. We surveyed expatriates 3 months before they returned. So this is when they were still expatriates. Then we surveyed them again, this time upon return, 3 months upon return, when they were repatriates. And then another 3 months later, we surveyed their supervisors according to repatriates knowledge transfer. And we have data for 129 of those assignee supervisor diets. Again, just to qualify, these are parent country expatriates who were sent from headquarters abroad to subsidiary and then returned to headquarters. We find support for the model, so these are all positive relationships. Concerning the interaction effect, we do find a synergistic interaction, showing that both embeddedness fit and communication are important. However, we also find that if either of the two factors, either communication frequency or embeddedness fit is low, repatriate knowledge transfer is not likely, it's not going to occur. So that really shows that both pathways are important. There's no shortcut. Okay, so you do need embeddedness fit in both units. It's not only the best of both worlds. You need both pathways for repatriate knowledge transfer to occur. So let me zoom out and talk about some of the contributions and then also some future directions for research. What we've done in this study, and I think the same goes for Fabian's presented first paper, that we're kind of moving beyond the retention attachment focus in embeddedness research, which has been very prominent in the both domestic and international business literature. So we're embedding, if you will, knowledge transfer as an important outcome, and we're really showing that it's repatriates' past and current organizational experiences that drive knowledge transfer. What we also show is that because international assignees essentially traverse intra-organization boundaries, right? They move from the origin unit to a subsidiary, they move back, and so they perceive and establish embeddedness fit regarding different physical contexts, the headquarters and the host unit, but also at different time points, right? So they establish fit when they're at the host unit, and then they have to re-establish fit back at headquarters. And our study actually shows that it's not automatic, you actually have to re-establish that fit. And so these dual pathways are important, and more importantly, repatriate knowledge transfer really depends on the assignee experiencing both a benefit in the host unit while on assignment and then upon return at headquarters. Somewhat more methodological contribution, we developed a new repatriate knowledge transfer scale as part of the study, and we think it's versatile because it actually includes both a task-related, relationship-oriented dimension with different types of knowledge that repatriates would transfer. You can collapse those, as we've done in this paper, but you can also use those scales separately if you're interested in one dimension or the other. And that's been validated on a separate sample. So we hope the scale is used in future research. And then briefly zooming out for some directions for future research, as a repatriate scholar and having been involved in several different projects, and I think I see a few of you who are involved as well. Well, the eternal pitfall of repatriate scholars is when you look at limitation sections of papers, is to compile a large enough sample. We've been struggling with this too. I think we've reached a good sample size, but I think this really calls for more collaborative research. I think we need to work together among scholars to access data from different organizations so we can actually compile sufficiently large samples, especially if you want to trace this over time, to gain more detail and insights. Obviously, this broader conceptualization of repatriation, we focused on typical parent country, expats who are sent to subsidiaries and return. You could think of repatriates or different types of global mobility, and people who return from different types of assignments. That has different implications for knowledge flows. Obviously, you could think of shorter term assignments. And with COVID, it'll be interesting to see what type of repatriation we'll see. Another aspect, zooming further out of this research, but when you look at the repatriation literature, I think something you see more broadly in the global mobility literature is that we tend to focus very much on variable-centered approaches, which is that we assume that the entire cohort of repatriate or expatriate or our primary unit of analysis can be aggregated to an aggregate set of parameters, and we look at constructs, relationships between constructs. But it's very possible that both expatriates or repatriates have, or subgroups of expatriates and repatriates have distinct experiences, and so it would be very useful to look at how these experiences differ, how people go through different trajectories of these experiences, for example, as there's variation in how identities change when people return from assignment. There might be variation in how people perceive organizational support and how this affects their experiences afterwards. And there might be differences in the intensity, duration, even the usefulness of transferred knowledge. And then finally, coming back to my earlier point, it would be useful to look at multilateral flows of knowledge transfer and repatriate knowledge transfer. In the next paper with Heejin, we'll see one example of where you could how you could look at this. But obviously, repatriates, for example, can also engage in forward knowledge sharing while they've returned and are still connecting with their host unit. So this is a broader view towards where we could go. So with this, let me stop here. Thank you all, and then hand over to the next presenter.
Thank you, Sebastian. I just have a quick question that falls more within the clarifying questions that somebody posed. Can you just very quickly clarify what type of knowledge did you measure? So managerial knowledge, technical knowledge, what type of knowledge was being transferred? Quickly, and then we move on to the next paper. We can come back to this point later.
Sure. So we looked at both task-related and relationship-related knowledge. The questions I asked at the beginning were understanding the market, but also relationships with host country employees. So we looked at both. There are two separate dimensions, but they aggregate to an overarching repatriate knowledge transfer scale. We collapsed them, but they can be used as two separate ones.
Okay, thank you very much. That was just a question and answer for one of the questions that was posed. Okay, thank you so much. Now moving on to our next paper. Heejin?
Oh.
Wonderful.
Sorry, my slides is not shared. Is it shared?
Yeah, it is. Yes, we can see it.
Thank you, Mila and Dana, for coordination, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Heejin Kim, an associate professor of Tohoku University, Japan. Today, on behalf of Sebastian Reiche, the previous presenter, and Anne-Wil Harzing, I will present our paper. Our study is about repatriates. As this picture shows, repatriates move the opposite direction to that of expatriates. That is from MNC subsidiaries to corporate headquarters. We explored how repatriation contribute to subsidiary capability building and subsidiary performance, subsidiary evolution, sorry. In the global stepping literature, we now know that mobility of individuals is a very important mechanism of knowledge transfers in MNCs. And as global work arrangement is getting diversified, repatriation has received increasing attention in HRM literature. Recent empirical studies indicated that repatriation is a complementary or possibly even superior means of knowledge transfer between subsidiaries and headquarters. However, we know little about how they transfer knowledge and with what outcome we can tell the knowledge is transferred by repatriates. So our research question is, how does repatriation contribute to knowledge transfer and in turn subsidiary performance? The core message of our paper is repatriation is a key practice to support subsidiaries' growth and development process. Traditionally, expatriation has long been thought as the most effective practice of knowledge transfer from headquarters to subsidiaries. With our findings, however, we argue that repatriation is another key practice of knowledge transfer from headquarters to subsidiaries. So in our paper, we explain how and why we can argue this. As a theoretical lens to explore our research question, we adopted organizational knowledge creation theory. This theory emphasized that tacit knowledge embedded in individuals lies at the heart of knowledge creation process. So dynamic human interactions enable knowledge conversion between tacit and explicit knowledge. These core ideas of Nonaka theory provide a very good ground to explore the effective design of global stepping practice that facilitate MNC knowledge flows. Our research context is Japanese MNCs in the Asian region, and our main analysis focused on 2 Japanese subsidiaries located in Korea that we named A sub and B sub. And this figure shows the number of repatriates and performance of the 2 subsidiaries for 13 years and 15 years each. And in the A sub in the left-hand side, the blue line denotes the number of repatriates sent to headquarters. And regarding the performance of A sub, the red line in the top figure shows growing annual sales, and the green line in the bottom figure shows the decreasing trend of defect rate. And in the B sub on the right-hand side, we could observe a very similar pattern of repatriation with that of A sub and increasing subsidiary performance for 15 years. As B sub is an R&D unit, there is no manufacturing index such as defect rate. So we can see from these figures that repatriation appears to coincide with subsidiary performance. However, what we really want to know is how successive repatriation practice and subsidiary performance are interrelated. That's why we conducted qualitative study based on interviews at both headquarters and subsidiaries, which enable us to disentangle the knowledge creation process and how it is related to subsidiary performance. This theoretical model summarizes our findings and outlines the process of repatriate knowledge transfer and subsidiary performance. When repatriates work at headquarters, they acquire different types of individual tacit knowledge. First, working at headquarters, they learn about new product, technology, and skills, including underlying rationales of tasks and procedures. And second, they learn parent company's national language and culture, which lays a very important foundation for effective knowledge transfer over time. And third, Repatriates also built relationship with headquarter colleagues through daily interactions, through which they learn who takes what kind of roles in the process of task completion and decision making. Then, after returning to their original unit, they subsequently convert what they have, the tacit knowledge they have acquired at headquarters, into organizational knowledge through the long-term function of repatriation. First, acting as teachers or trainers, they lead project teams with their junior colleagues and disseminate what they have learned at headquarters to other subsidiary members. And second, by keeping in touch with their former headquarters colleagues, the former repatriate ensure the continued flow of information between the headquarters and subsidiaries, and make the communication between the two organizations very smooth and speedy. Eventually, this short-term and long-term function of repatriation contribute to subsidiary performance. The two subsidiaries initially only had a market-seeking role, but they have developed manufacturing and R&D capabilities. They also expanded their products and customer bases very successfully, as evidenced by the growing annual sales that we've seen in the previous slides. As a result of such capability building, their roles and responsibilities in their global network have significantly evolved. Currently, they not only deal with their local customers, but also support their headquarters and other foreign subsidiaries. Our study bridges and contributes to international HRM and global strategy literatures in three distinct areas. First, our study extends organizational knowledge creation theory to MNC context. Especially applying Nonaka's theory to our study helped us to explain why repatriation can be a superior means of knowledge transfer to subsidiaries. Because repatriates share the same background with their subsidiary employees in terms of language, culture, and business background, their interactions with their team members are likely to be more extensive, effective, and in-depth compared to the foreign expatriates. And second, our study has revealed the micro-foundational process of knowledge transfer by repatriates, showing how this process occurs through the short-term and long-term function of repatriation. And yes, third, our study clarified the strategic value of repatriation, especially in the process of subsidiary evolution. We provide a deeper understanding of how a subsidiary can transform itself from a passive recipient of headquarter knowledge to an active contributor to the MNC network through successive repatriation. We'd like to propose two areas for future study. First, more studies needed to clarify when repatriates are more necessary and effective. First, geography, cultural, political, and economic proximity between the home and host country might influence the necessity and effectiveness of repatriation. And second, when an MNC's home market is saturated and shrinking, MNCs might have a higher need to utilize repatriation to further stimulate the knowledge creation in foreign subsidiaries. And third, when subsidiaries are located in volatile host market with rapid market growth and high competitive pressure, the necessity and effectiveness of repatriation might be higher. Another relevant topic for future study would be how complementary roles of repatriates and expatriates contribute to intra-MNC knowledge transfer and value creation in subsidiaries. Important questions include how different types of international signees interact, and when and how they create synergies, and how their interactions and synergies contribute to subsidiary performance. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the overview of our paper, and we look forward to your questions and comments. If you're interested in our paper development journey, please refer to these 2 blog posts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heejin, for your wonderful presentation. Just one clarifying question from one of the attendees who asked about your data analysis. How did you analyze the data? Just very briefly.
Oh, we did an inductive process of data analysis, iterating, the theory and the raw data, and continuous discussion among the 3 authors.
Yes, and I encourage everyone to look at the papers. They're available. I think they're all open access on the JIP's website, because of course in 15 minutes we cannot do them justice. There's a lot to unpack in all of those papers, and Heejin's paper in particular. There's a lot of depth and sort of interesting findings that come out of this that are just very difficult to capture in such a short time. So I do encourage everyone to seek out the papers. So of course, chat has lit up, questions have lit up. I'm trying to keep track of both of them. I'm invariably failing, but I'll do my best. And my co-pilot, please jump in if I'm sort of missing a big piece. So I'll try to have a question for each of the papers, even though some of the things that I see popping up really relate to all papers. So let me try to be as systematic as one can in circumstances like that. So Fabian, if you don't mind me starting with you, there was some discussion around CQ and its relevance beyond expatriation. So its relevance for knowledge transfer for populations like skilled migrants. And I wonder if you can comment on that. How do you see this research going beyond expats, thinking of CQ as a key variable?
Okay, thank you for the question. Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And I think cross-cultural intelligence is related with intercultural, cross-cultural encounters or interactions. And there has been also quite a few other studies. I think one in Journal of Applied Psychology that looked at real estate agents in the US. Yeah, and then international foreign sales, as they call it. So whenever we have an international encounter, I think CQ would be relevant, particularly useful. If we have interaction between one German and another German in Germany, CQ is probably of not much use. But if you think of migrants, a foreign migrant with the local, then of course we have these cross-cultural interactions, and we have different cultural understandings, different behavior, different attitudes, and so forth. And if you do possess CQ, then this could be really helpful. And the more and the different the context, also in our case, if we look at cultures that are in-group oriented, then CQ is particularly valuable. And so it would be useful for migrants or any kind of international encounter, and some more or less, and that depends on the context, where it takes place, what it is about, and what is the purpose. And so I think that's also why so many people are fascinated by CQ. Yeah, we have intelligence, cognitive abilities, and then we have emotional intelligence. And I think for IB scholars, it's cultural intelligence, what we're really interested in. And I think much more research can be still done on it. And I think that I would also like to see and to be part of that movement.
Yeah, so CQ, thumbs up. But if I can just sort of add a question of my own here, you do find that context changes things, right? So it's more relevant in certain settings, and especially in the context of migration, you didn't find a moderating effect of friendliness towards migrants, whatever your contextual variable was. Does it stand to reason that in some settings CQ is less relevant and we can do without it?
I think, as you say already, in some contexts more important than others. We were also a little puzzled that migration policies, the openness of the environment did not make a difference. We couldn't really explain it. Maybe the measure not perfect, or maybe then also some people are so strongly discouraged because if the regulation says there is no, you cannot stay longer in a country because after 1 year you have to return to your country, then maybe also it's too severe a pressure, so people just don't care. Yeah, and I think that's exactly what we need more research on to understand the context that facilitates or creates barriers for the effectiveness of cultural intelligence.
Excellent, and I can see that there's more interest in that question. Dana, your hand went up first.
I was just going to point out to Marie-Therese's question, in the, which is related to that issue and could be an explanation of that puzzle, or at least one brick in that puzzle, Fabian, that you described. Marie-Therese is asking, would there be no link between country culture and immigration policies? Question mark. Maybe I just thought that maybe we can take it now that we're talking about that.
I'm sorry, I did not fully catch your question. What's the main question? Can you rephrase a bit?
It's a question that Marie-Therese asked in the Q&A. It says, would there be no link between country culture and immigration policies? Question.
Oh, this question. I think there was a mild correlation, and there could
minus
be
-0.22. I just checked it.
Ah, you're even better informed than me. Yes, there is some, because that's also in the mindset, because that's also what we would expect. There is some kind of, because they're more closed-minded, narrow-minded, also then because the people, they create these regulations. And then eventually they may all create these more closed and foreigner unfriendly regulations. But it also takes some time to change regulation, because there can be also a few decision-making makers that do implement or not. So they don't go perfectly hand in hand in time, and also to what extent it is represented among the decision makers and the general population. And also in-group collectivism is also not a perfect measure of openness towards foreigners either, but we thought this is more general cultural value. So there is some kind, but they're not the same, and they're distinct, but there's certain overlap, or maybe even some causality, which could of course also be explored in some kind of macro level IB research, I would imagine. And that may eventually also have some long-term effects on more innovation at large at the country level, where we aggregate individuals to organizations and to the country level. That's not really my main interest, but I do imagine that could be fascinating research and perfect for Journal of International Business Policy or JIBS, to really go and scrutinize these questions. And then we can give answers based on empirics, not just on my opinion. That would be really interesting.
Thank you, Fabian. I believe Anne-Wil's hand went up afterwards.
Yeah, and I think Fabian has already partially answered my question. I was fascinated by that difference as well, but obviously it's kind of the general difference between cultural and structural variables, with the cultural variables possibly being much closer to individual interaction within companies, and the structural variables being a little more distant. And also, without wanting to make any political statements, what decision makers in a country do in terms of migration policies is not always the reflection of the majority of the population of a country. And I think we can think of lots of countries where that is the case. So I think it's not that surprising you might not have found a significant effect, but it is really interesting to have that linkage between cultural and structural, I think.
Yes. Yeah. Thanks, Anne-Wil. Sebastian?
Just to open kind of another aspect to cultural intelligence. It's obviously, you can assess your own cultural intelligence, and that gives you the ability and that gives you the confidence, but then as we kind of think about the link then also to knowledge transfer. But obviously others may perceive your cultural intelligence too, and they may do so in a different way. In fact, we had looked at data where we measured both self and peer ratings of cultural intelligence. They were not very highly correlated, and so that does show us that sometimes we think we're proficient and others may think they're not proficient, And once you have a very diverse context, I think this might just become more complex. So it might actually be quite interesting to look at cultural intelligence from both sides of ratings, and that might even be related to understandings of the context or how the context assesses us.
All right, thank you. And there's some more questions to ponder in the text, which we may come back to if we have time. I want to move the conversation along to the next paper around dimensionality of CQ and whether aspects of that are more relevant. But I would like to come to the second paper now. And there was a very interesting question posed to Sebastian and co-authors. Can you relate your findings to Bartlett and Goshel's transnational organization, that idea of like dual embeddedness? I was also thinking, if you think about it configurationally, I don't know if you've tried that, sort of the low, the high, the high lows. I don't know if you did that, but
yes, I mean, we looked at, Fabian, please chime in as well, because I mean, I think you looked at the data. So obviously the both embedded types of embeddeds are correlated. So if you're embedded in the host unit, you tend to also be more embedded at headquarters. So there seems to be a process mechanics. If you're doing this well in one context, you're more prone to doing this well in the other. However, for example, we didn't find direct effects of host unit embeddedness to knowledge transfer. So there is a mediated relationship. And there was also no moderation from one to the other. So they were really two distinct pathways. So reviewers did ask us, and then we looked into this. The other aspect, obviously, I guess also comes back to what the direction of flows. There is a dynamic there, but technically we don't have the data to really look at the dynamic of how this pans out. So as a function of you being embedded first in the host unit, how does this affect your embeddedness at the headquarters, and are there factors that lead to this? So ideally, you'd be measuring this repeatedly over time. But I think it's a very interesting comment. I think it will help us to understand how you re-establish embeddedness and how this happens over time. And I haven't seen this, so I think that would be a really interesting future research area.
Yeah. And I mean, again, for those of our attendees that haven't seen the papers, it's sort of the data is across time, right? Which sort of helps disentangle some of these issues. And in that way, the paper's superior to a lot of that. There's a very hard data to collect. So congrats for that. Dana?
Just going to follow up on pick up, let's say, ideas from what Sebastian was pointing at right now. I think dual embeddedness is something that we will be looking, well, not even dual, but multiple, that could be triple, or you name it, right? And if you think about it, and it's strange to say it now at the webinar that is devoted to expatriation, repatriation, impatriation, right? But if you look what multinationals are doing right now, they actually, experimenting with this new approach. It's Sebastian and I discussed in the chat, this work from anywhere, right? Yeah. So what, for instance, one multinational we're working with right now, they have a Danish employee who decided to sit in Bulgaria, in fact, and work from there. However, she's connected to a local unit in Bulgaria, to the subsidiary. And this is just the location because she's actually an HR employee and there is no HR in subsidiary in Bulgaria. But this person, without being expatriate or impatriate or repatriate, is actually engaged in a lot of knowledge transfer, right? Because, both country-specific knowledge transfer as well as headquarter-specific knowledge transfer. So that, and I think that's where hopefully we could, look into the future to understand that dynamics, because, and this is just a very provocative statement from my side, we kind of decided to put people in the boxes and label them being expatriate, repatriate, impatriate, assuming that these staffing decisions are done or, made by employers alone, and they are not any longer, right? Particularly in our environment. So it's just a little bit of provocation to follow up on Sebastian's call for future research.
But I think that's a fascinating question. So not quickly, slowly. That's a question now for all of you. Sort of the direction. Imagine 10 years from now, will we be able to publish these papers? And by that, I mean, will these directions be so clear? Because one of the papers is clearly on expats, one is clearly on repats, and Heejin's paper is on impats. And, you know, and indeed, she made a very reasoned argument of why that's their particular characteristics that contribute to this being a superior way of transferring knowledge. So can we publish a similar set of papers? Will we be able to distinguish between these pathways? Anne-Wil.
It would help if I would unmute myself before starting to talk. Well, this is only the first mistake we have in this webinar, so well done to all of you. When Dana was speaking, I was thinking again of how quickly, in fact, the field has developed over the last 20 years. We started looking only at expatriates, and it was very much headquarter focused. Then we started looking a little bit at repatriates, but still expatriates and repatriates is still very much headquarter focused, because it's all expatriates and repatriates coming back. Dana already mentioned that people can work from anywhere now, so we can have kind of people from subsidiaries going to headquarters, but also to other subsidiaries. And linking back to Marie-Therese's comment about the transnational corporation, the transnational corporation was all about subsidiaries interacting as well, and subsidiaries being able to be a center of excellence. It wasn't simply about headquarters and one subsidiary. So I would like, in addition to the work from anywhere, to see more about maybe transpatriates going from one subsidiary to another. And that, I think, would also allow us to link this more to another field which has developed really, really quickly in the last 20 years, and that's global talent management. Because global talent management is all about kind of where people would fit best to develop their global career. And I think going to that domain would help us much more than sticking with this headquarters subsidiary. And can I throw in one more thing, and then I'll shut up for the rest of the webinar probably. I would also like to link this to a previous comment, which I thought was really provocative. And this was about the value of knowledge and the value that is attached to knowledge depending on the person's hierarchical position, but also the standing of the country in the world. And one of the participants commented on how the French headquarters didn't want to learn from the Singaporean subsidiary, or rather the repats thought the French headquarters didn't want to learn. We attach value to different sources of knowledge. And I think that's another really fruitful avenue to look into. So yeah, I would hope we can't publish these papers in 10 years time. I would hope we have moved on.
Thank you, Anne-Wil. And actually, I'll come back to one of your points later, but I've already interrupted Sebastian once, and I do not want to do that again. So Sebastian, please go ahead.
Well, my comment has evolved as I was listening to Anne-Wil. I was just thinking, and also Dana to respond. I think it's an interesting question. So where does this leave the organization, right? Because yes, these decisions, there's more agency of the individual to decide where we're working. And I may not even call myself an expat because I just decide to go out and work elsewhere. And in fact, that links to the discussion on migrants, right? So I mean, obviously, it's a long-term, semi-permanent move, and that comes with its own implications. But I still think, and that's why I like the comment to global talent management, there might be a lot of self-selection happening there. If I can, as an organization, create certain conditions where a certain talent might want to work for me, for my organization, in different units across the globe, then we're moving the initiative from the organization to the individual. We've seen this in the self-initiated assignment literature already, but we might be seeing this in different forms more. But I think the organization will still have that question. Well, what does it mean for us? We need certain people for certain jobs in our organization. People are more self-motivated to do this differently. So yeah, it needs to be solved in certain ways.
Well, certainly this is not the last time we talk about it. We may we'll talk about it differently, but clearly it's an issue for organizations. Now, Heejin, please go ahead. If I may ask to unmute yourself. Thank you.
Just short comment, because your question is so interesting, and considering the CQ and embeddedness that the first and second presentation of today, I think just people, a lot of different types of people moving around does not make a lot of sense. Maybe I'm a little bit skeptical about whether the distinction of repatriation, expatriation, repatriation will disappear in 10 years. Because yes, if it might be possible if, let's say that everybody speak English very well and everybody share a certain cultural background, but CQ and embeddedness, and considering that dynamic human interaction is needed to transfer knowledge, I think it might be, a little bit difficult in 10 years. That's my opinion.
If we all had a crystal ball, but that's actually quite an interesting question around, and there was either in the comments or in the Q&A, a question around the speed with which things happen, right? And that everything is digitalized and people are not moving. And given how prominently embeddedness features in all of the papers, whether it's specifically defined as a variable or it's just in, as you discuss the findings, you see that people must have stayed and established connections, right? So even in your paper, people were posted for 1 to 7 years, right? How will the increasing speed of doing business and direction, sort of mobility of personnel in whichever direction, using whatever means, when things happen so quickly, will the role of embeddedness change somehow? Will there be other pathways to transfer knowledge if embeddedness diminishes? So embeddedness, how relevant, I mean, does it stay relevant, or how do people become embedded when things happen so quickly? I said too many things. So whoever wants to venture to take that question first.
Oh, it's not about my paper. Just
you can absolutely. It would be lovely if you can take that question. So think about it. Speaking, given what you just said, right? Must you embed to effectively transfer knowledge? And how can you embed if things move so quickly?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe, and see, I'm asking another question here, violating the rules of moderation. Your paper was very situated, Japanese multinationals, Korean subsidiaries. So these are cultures that, first of all, countries, businesses that do HR differently, right? And cultures that have a long-term orientation, where you don't expect things to happen every quarter. So maybe that makes a difference. So embeddedness, will embedded, help me out here, somebody. I want to know 7 things in the remaining 7 minutes. Sebastian.
Fabian, I think if you want to go, I'll go next.
Either way, or we can talk also at the same time. I think there's been a long debate during the past 2 years. I think COVID really hit us, in particular our line of research, expatriation. There's been a major shift. Also for me, I didn't even dare to submit any expat paper because no one is interested in this topic, because there was deregulation, restriction, there was but much less mobility. And I know it myself, I wanted to go to Japan, I couldn't, I need to get a visa, super difficult, and even then, very complicated. And digitalization has been a trend, I think, for quite a few years, and there's always been the trend. It replaces humans, it replaces mobility and so forth. But I think that really hit us the most and changed the whole industry was probably COVID and the travel restriction deregulation. And so we see a major change, and I think some of you know from own experience, from interviews, surveys, and so forth. So companies have changed their policies. And also I played, I think, tennis with a friend. He used to be a frequent traveler and here and there all the time to Asia and elsewhere from Germany, and they don't. They localize more. But also he and others know if it's about knowledge sharing, learning, You can't just do it. I mean, you can do some of it. We have this webinar, we exchange our ideas, but if you really want to do a big project and discuss it in depth and then plan and this and that, we can't just do it over a webinar. We really need to meet. Or if I have a PhD student, he wants to learn something, I would send him maybe half a year in a different country at least and really absorb something and learn. And so that also, I think, has huge implications for expatriation. Yeah, we have less in and out, less frequent, but these long-term and learning, it just takes time. Yeah, and it doesn't matter, I think, if it's Japanese, German, or American. You can't just learn quickly, watch a video, and then you know everything. I mean, that's, as we know, a lot of knowledge resides in people, and to transfer it from one to another, it just takes time. But some of it, of course, I think we can now do it virtually and try to limit time and so forth. And so there are many avenues. So I think global mobility, expatriation remains important, but the structure and the types change and it gets blurred. And I think I would like to stop and let Sebastian continue talking.
No, I guess, I mean, what's interesting to see across these three papers is that knowledge transfer is costly and time intensive, right? So, I mean,
right.
Heejin's paper is really, it is successive in that you're moving people over time to build a foundation so that based on that, you have sufficient knowledge that you can share, you can convert into organizational knowledge. Fabian and our paper as well, right? So there was no shortcut. You really needed these two embeddedness for this to happen. I think that shows that you can't just accelerate that. I think what might be interesting is what are the mechanisms. Fabian, as you were talking, it struck me in the global virtual team literature, people talk about swift trust, right? You can build trust quickly. And I wonder from the embeddedness literature, I mean, we've talked about organization embeddedness. For an organization, maybe the organization couldn't care less whether you're embedded in the organization as long as you're embedded in the team, in the interactions with the people with who you're meaningfully exchanging. So I guess maybe the level or the reference point at which you have to be embedded might be different. But I think that, yeah, the general mechanisms are not going to change. Maybe it's just the level, right?
Yeah, it's certainly interesting, especially you read all these things about, you know, the world as we know it is over and it's all in your world and how we manage things. And you kind of go, well, really, is it? But certain things have undoubtedly changed, but how that will impact things like knowledge transfer is an open question. So I wonder if Heejin, if you had something to add to that conversation or Anne-Wil around the role of long-term embeddedness and its endangeredness in the future.
And just I agree with Fabian's and Sebastian's ideas. And yeah, if we really, if the world is quickly changed, we cannot educate the PhD student in 1 year. I think that's kind of something similar in nature.
All right, and I see there's I'm trying to keep my eyes on the chat and a lot is happening. So I do encourage people to both stay with us, but also look at the chat because there's a lot of interesting references that are being shared. Maybe we can save the chat, Dana, I don't know, and then maybe we can send it to attendees because there's a lot of great resources. So questions have somehow mysteriously stopped. I think there's a lot happening in the chat rather than in the Q&A. And of course, we can take each of those themes and talk about it for another 10-15 minutes. I think we have a good 10 more minutes of discussion. Dana, am I missing a big theme? Go for it.
Okay, thank you. I have actually, Mila, I would like you to be on that big question right now, because it is really a big question. And I hope to hear lots of provocations given our crowd here. Equally to people in the chat, please type in your takes on it. So my question is on the theme: what is the next big question in knowledge transfer? And I'm not talking about small improvements that, you know, well, of course, also quite meaningful that we usually talk about, you know, in our research implication. I'm asking you, you know, get into the wild zone and think about something qualitatively different, something that we haven't been done until now for whatever reasons. either our own cognitive disabilities or opportunities or methodologies, I don't know. So what is the next big question in knowledge transfer? What is the next big agenda? Who do I ask first? Mila, how about you? Now you've been asking all the questions.
Wow, you've turned it on me now. So, I mean, I think I don't want to circumvent your question, but I was thinking more in terms of methodology, right? Because it's a big wild world now, right? Because the ground appears to be shifting underneath our feet, and some changes, I believe, are not as permanent as we would like to believe, or some would like to believe, but some changes, it's undoubted that the world has changed, right? So I do think that more qualitative approaches would become very meaningful rather than surveys, because as we all know, through a survey, you can only test an idea you already have, which is why I was quite fascinated by Heejin's paper, because it's taken years to collect the data. So that scares me because she very well details when interviews were done, and it took 5 years. So I don't know I have the stamina to do it, but I want to compliment her and her co-authors, because I do think we need to engage in this just to see what has changed first, to then figure out how it can impact things, right?
Okay.
So that would be my first take on it, and let's take a sort of dance around the room, and then we can come back to this.
Sounds good. Thank you, Anne-Wil.
Yeah, and it's clear that we are all thinking along the same lines, because that was exactly what my answer was going to be. But I want to take it a little bit further, Mila, because I'm always reflecting on how this will work in our current academic structures.
Yes.
And really, I think we need more of the work like Heejin has done with the team in Japan, where there's a very close collaboration between business and academia, which is not something that we have in many other countries, but also where you have the time to actually collect all those data, reflect and go back and reflect again, and collect secondary data from these companies as well. So we can only do this if we change our academic incentive structures and are not expected to publish as much as possible, but publish really meaningful stuff. So I don't think we can ask academics to do all of this and then subject them to the same academic incentives. So by all means, let's do more qualitative research, but then let's also appreciate that this is far more difficult to do and is far more time consuming.
Very good point, thank you. Also, of course, the biggest question before we get to method is the state of the theory, right? Because regardless what you do, the first question we need to answer is what is the state of the theory in that particular area. And I was also fascinated by some of the comments, and also there was a question actually in the Q&A, you know, how, Sebastian, your point around the digital technology that you made earlier, I think these things are also coming in and they're going to change, you know, not just the way we do research, but also the way how we do research. Sebastian, before I go any further, do you want to pick up from here, or is it on the previous comment?
Well, I guess it's related. I was just going to say that I still think we haven't really figured out. So when we talk the webinars about how knowledge travels, and travel is ongoing. It's not just between two people, right? It diffuses, and it's usually more impactful if the knowledge then gets picked up. That's why we do these webinars where we share knowledge, others pick it up, work on it, and back. And we'll to the comment about how we work as scholars. This is incremental because we share knowledge and then pick it up and use the next iteration of knowledge to work on this further. And I don't think we've really figured this out. It's difficult to collect this type of data. We'd almost call for open source, not databases, data sets that others can pick up. But even just the process itself, but I'm sure a global work, however we want to call them in 10 years' time, might share knowledge. This knowledge gets shared with colleagues. They pick this up, they share this with their own colleagues, and this is almost, it translates into to other people, and that's where the impact, I think, is. And I think we haven't. It's difficult to do, but we haven't done that yet.
Yeah, absolutely. And we also, again, should remember that with the advances in artificial intelligence, it's not just, people to people, right? So in that Nonaka spiral that you presented, Heijin, externalization processes may be heavily influenced by the digital technology because of machine learning, data mining and other things that suddenly come into information exchange processes. All right, Fabian, what's your take on the next big question, the knowledge transfer in multinationals?
I think before the big question, probably two minor questions. I think as we discussed, I think this multilateral approach, multiple stakeholders, different directions, different types of globally mobile people. I think there's still a lot of room that we haven't looked. That would be, from my perspective, maybe some what you would call some incremental steps, but where we still have quite some steps to go, in my opinion. And then the next big question, I think, Dana, as you just mentioned, that also would come to my mind, it would be artificial intelligence. Yeah, that would be the next. It's not the next new step that has been around, but it has improved and accelerated so much during the past few years. If you also look in the literature, information systems research, and in HR, it has been exploded. But we haven't seen that development in our line of research. I'm not aware of so much. And really to look into that, and how digitalization replaces, assists, enhances global employees. And I think there's a lot of room. And also in terms of methodology, I think we talk about qualitative surveys and we talk about interviews. That's nothing new, but there's so much, as you mentioned, data mining, getting lots of data from mobility patterns, and then maybe you can also supplement that to do mixed method study with interviews or surveys and really get there. Because so far we have looked more at the small picture, one company, 30 interviews, our study, 1,300, we're like, wow, so big. But that's not big data. It's still small puzzle pieces. But of course, and that can be supplemented. And I think there's more room for such kind of research.
So clearly, Fabian, you're also pointing out that these whatever those next big questions in knowledge transfer, they will be answered from the multidisciplinary perspective, because, for instance, the sniffing technology, there's so much going right now in computer science that we could easily integrate in our studies, or even don't have to go that far. Every single multinational right now has lots of company data, in the panel forms ready to plug and play, so to say, on every single individual who worked in their firms ever. Mila, you had a hand and then you took it down, but I insist, please.
It's just because I got very excited and I said, yes, because I do think that's, I don't have the ability to do that, but I'm sure there's a smart person out there, many smart people out there that can start looking at that data. Imagine looking at emails and what knowledge gets transferred by emails. That would be a fascinating question. So it was more excitement. And then I said, okay, well, you have excitement as well, so I can lower my hand.
That's good. Hey, Jean, I was wondering if you'd like to add anything to this discussion, because I have noticed that you nodded a couple of times when we were talking.
Unmute.
Sorry. Listening to your discussions, I thought the looking into the process of how the companies substitute the physical mobility of their the international assignees so far to the AI or the other technical way would be interesting. There might be a lot of challenges, and as Mila now picked up the email, maybe there might be some distinctions that they can transfer with some technology or not, or there's a lot of such a like a difficult time for challenges and trials and errors. So the process would be very interesting, I thought.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Well, there was actually quite a few references to the global virtual teams. I think it's something that we didn't have time to talk today, but it's definitely something that we will be picking up in our future webinars from Journal of International Business Studies and Journal of International Business Policy. Now, I would like to echo Alan's point in the chat, who wrote, how, when, where can we continue this obviously rich, critical, and compelling conversation moving forward? And my invitation to you would be, let's do it and at AIB in Miami. If you haven't registered for the conference, please consider doing so. There will be opportunities to both to be in person as well as some limited opportunities for the virtual presentation. That's, you know, I missed you all, and I'm, despite of the advances in technology, really looking forward to face-to-face knowledge exchanges. At this moment, I'd like to thank very much our presenters for their excellent insights. A very fascinating conversation that although all papers have been already published, but I feel that there is a lot we can still, you know, talk and discuss around them. My special thanks go to Mila, my co-pilot, who've done a fantastic job, as well as Anne-Wil for your contribution to our discussion. So once again, to all of you participants, it was great to touch base with you, albeit through the chat. Very much hope to see you at AIB in Miami, and please stay tuned with our next JIP webinars that are coming very soon. Thank you very much for today, and goodbye.
Thanks, Donna. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming.